Every town has a dark side. Now, we all know the story of the Zodiac Killer to some degree. The mysterious psychopath who terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s, taunting police with encrypted messages and claiming responsibility for dozens of murders. But what many don't know is just how many legitimate suspects there are in America's most baffling serial killer case. And for decades, the story is centered around one man, Arthur Lee Allen. The former elementary school teacher became the prime suspect and was the only person ever named publicly by police. Netflix's latest documentary puts him back in the spotlight, presenting what seems like an airtight case. But here's the thing. The Zodiac case is far more complex than that neat narrative suggests. While police confirmed 5 murders and 2 attempted murders, the killer himself claimed 37 victims. Investigators believe the real number could be anywhere between 20 and 28. And these numbers alone should tell us something. But we're not looking at a simple case with an obvious suspect. We're looking at one of the most complex criminal investigations in all of America's history. Hey guys, it's Andrew, and thanks for tuning into this episode of Everytown, where today we're going to look into all the other suspects who very well could be the Zodiac, and the evidence is beyond scary. So let's head over to California, check out the truth about the Zodiac Killer case.
Lots of people think the infamous Zodiac Killer is dead and that his mysterious code has died with him. But there's a cop in Central California who says he can prove otherwise.
Let me take you back to where it all began just for a quick refresher so we're all on the same page. As a thick fog rolled in from the bay on December 20th of 1968 in Benicia, California, 2 innocent teenagers out for a cruise were unsuspectingly about to become the first victims of America's darkest serial killing mystery. On Lake Herman Road, a lonely stretch of pavement connecting Benicia to Vallejo, 17-year-old David Faraday had borrowed his mother's Rambler for his first date with 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen. It was a big night and they were good kids. Their parents expected them home by 11 at the latest, but of course, they never made it. At 11:10 p.m., a passing motorist spotted their bodies by a turnout. And David was still breathing, barely, with a bullet in his head. And Betty Lou was lying face down 28 feet from the car, shot 5 times in the back as she ran for her life. And the veteran first responders later said it was the worst crime scene they'd ever come across.
One of the worst things I ever witnessed.
And this is the origins of how it all began. And 2 teens on a first date are also the first confirmed to be targeted by the Zodiac. But nobody knows that yet at the time. Nobody is aware that this is just the opening act in a performance of terror that would span decades and claim anywhere from 5 to 37 lives. The 6 months pass, July 4th, 1969. While America celebrates Independence Day, Darlene Ferrin and Michael Maggio park at Blue Rock Springs, which is less than 4 miles from where David and Betty Lou died. It was just past midnight when a car pulls up beside them, shines its headlights and drives away. And 10 minutes later, the same car returns. This time, someone steps out carrying a flashlight and a 9mm pistola. Without uttering a single word, they fire 9 shots through the window. Darlene dies instantly, and Michael jumped into the back seat when his instincts tried to get him as far away from the shots as possible. And somehow, he manages to survive. He'll later describe the shooter as a heavy-set man wearing glasses, approaching their car with a purpose, as if he'd done this all before. 40 minutes later, a man calls the Vallejo Police Department.
The call is taken by Vallejo Police Dispatcher Nancy Slover, and the caller speaks in a very low, monotone voice and describes where 2 bodies can be found. He also states that they've been shot with a 9mm Luger, and before he ends the phone call, he also says, "I also killed those kids last year."
The caller knows details that haven't been released to the public. He knows about David and Betty Lou, the type of gun used, and soon he'll start writing his letters. September 27, 1969, Lake Berryessa. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard are enjoying a peaceful afternoon by the lake when a man approaches them. He's wearing a black executioner's hood with a white cross circle symbol on the chest. He carries a gun and a foot-long knife. The man tells them he's an escaped convict from a Colorado prison. He needs their car and money to flee to Mexico. It's all a lie, of course. He binds them with plastic clothesline, then brutally stabs them both. Cecilia is struck 10 times, and Brian 6. As Cecilia lies dying, the killer walks calmly to their car and draws his signature symbol on the door, a circle with a cross through it.
Brian and Cecilia both underwent surgery, and Cecilia survived for 2 more days, but then she died from her wounds. Brian survived and was able to describe what happened and provide a description of the killer.
Then comes Paul Stein, October 11, 1969. He's a taxi driver working a Saturday night shift in San Francisco. His last fare takes him to the wealthy Presidio Heights neighborhood. At the intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets, the passenger shoots him in the head. Then, in an act of chilling deliberation, he tears a piece from Stein's shirt, a trophy he'll later mail to the San Francisco Chronicle with a letter. These are the 5 confirmed kills and 2 attempted ones we all know about. But here's where the story gets darker. Because while police can only prove 5 murders, the Zodiac claims there are many more. And sure, Arthur Lee Allen might have been the most famous suspect, but when you look at the other ones, the forgotten men who might have been the Zodiac, you can see why this mystery isn't entirely solved yet. Let me introduce you to Lawrence Kane. Kane's story starts with a woman named Kathleen Johns. In 1970, Johns was driving on Highway 132 near Modesto with her infant daughter when a man forced her car off the road. He offered to help and then held her captive for 2 hours as he drove aimlessly through the dark. Johns eventually escaped, and years later, when shown a photo lineup, she pointed to Kane without hesitation. "That's him," she said. "That's the man who took me." But let's slow down and really understand what happened that night because the details are scary. It's March 22nd, 1970, around 11:30 p.m.
It was late at night. I had left in the evening, and the car behind me started flashing its lights, bright and dim, bright and dim. And the car pulled up behind me, and this guy got out, and he said that my back wheel was wobbly.
He then pulls up beside her, gesturing frantically about her wheel. Being pregnant and alone on the highway with a baby, Johns feels she has to pull over if something is seriously wrong. The man then parks and gets out. He seems polite and is well-spoken, and he points to her tire, explaining that it's loose, offering to tighten it up for her. And Johns watches as he apparently fixes the problem, but when she tries to drive away, her wheel nearly falls off. As it turned out, the man had actually loosened all the lug nuts, but she didn't realize it. Now, what happens next is 2 hours of psychological torture. He offers to drive her to a nearby service station, but instead of helping, he begins a nightmarish journey through the back roads of Tracy, California. Every time Johns asks where they were going, he calmly changes the subject. He drives in circles, running stop signs, speaking about casual things while Johns sits frozen in terror, clutching her baby. Now, he was so calm, Johns would later say. That's what scared me the most. Like he'd done this before, like he was enjoying it. When Johns finally managed to escape, jumping from the car and hiding in a field with her daughter, the man circled the area with his headlights for hours, hunting them in the darkness. But here's where Kane's story gets darker. 8 years before this incident, in 1962, Kane suffered a traumatic brain injury in a car crash that changed him forever. And doctors documented damage to his left frontal lobe, the part of the brain that controls impulses and aggressive behavior. The medical records show he developed an inability to control his urges for self-gratification. And this is something that many people have experienced, suffering severe head trauma and coming out a totally different person. After the accident, Kane's criminal behavior escalated. Police records show multiple arrests for voyeurism and prowling in the months leading up to the first confirmed Zodiac killings. Kane would hide in the shadows, watching women, learning their routines, and one of those women may have been Darlene Ferrin. Ferrin was murdered at Blue Rock Springs Park on that July 4th night as mentioned. But for months before her death, she told friends about a man who was following her. He'd show up at the restaurant where she waited tables and sit for hours without ordering, just watching. Her sister Pam Huckabee later identified Kane as the stalker. And just 5 days after Ferrin's murder, Kane traded in his car for a new one. So is that just a coincidence? And Kane's movements also mirror the Zodiac's timeline with an unsettling precision. He lived near the Lake Herman Road murders. He worked at the same casino as Donna Lass when she disappeared in Lake Tahoe, another suspected Zodiac victim. Officer Donald Fook, who saw the Zodiac fleeing after the Paul Stein murder, said Kane resembled the killer more than any other suspect he'd seen. Police files show that even after the Zodiac killing stopped, Kane continued to be investigated for harassment and stalking, always with the same pattern: watching, following, terrifying his victims while maintaining a calm, almost pleasant demeanor. But he died in 2010, taking whatever secrets he had to his grave. But while Lawrence Kane haunted the highways and casinos of Northern California, another suspect was creating his own dark legacy in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And his name was Gary Francis Post. He wasn't identified as a suspect until 2021, when a team of 40 former law enforcement officials, intelligence officers, and forensic experts called the Case Breakers named him as the most likely candidate to be the Zodiac. At first glance, their claim seemed out there, but as you dig deeper into Post's life, you most certainly do uncover a web of disturbing behavior that spans decades.
Sacramento attorney Mark Reichel and his longtime investigator John Kennedy named Gary Post as the likely Zodiac killer years ago.
Let's start with the obvious connections. Post was an Air Force veteran who lived in California during the Zodiac killings. He had military training, weapons knowledge, and access to the areas where the murders took place. But it's what happened after the Zodiac killing stopped that makes his case truly disturbing. In the small mountain town of Groveland, California, Post began recruiting young men in their late teens and early 20s. Locals called them the Posse, a group of followers who stayed loyal to Post for decades. He would take them deep into the Sierra Nevada mountains, teaching them what one former member described as killing techniques. They often practiced on animals, and here's something interesting for all true crime buffs. If you know anything about killers, then you understand they each have their own unique way of doing it. It's a big part of how many of them get caught. And some like to strangle their victims, others shoot them, and they rarely change up their tactics. Some like to go for a specific type of victim, filtering them out by a certain age range or always having a characteristic like blonde hair. And whatever it is they choose to do, well, they do it because it's the thing that gets them off. And with the 7 victims we know of as belonging to the Zodiac, well, they're all over the place. Yes, many were young couples, but some were shot, others stabbed. The lone taxi driver, Paul Stein, was shot. Murders were done at night and in the daytime, and sometimes the killer wore a hooded mask, and sometimes not. The point being that even though it's circumstantial, it sounds a lot like these murders were done by different people. Perhaps people who were part of this group. And guys who were imitating one another, but each of them adding their own spin to it. And two of the victims surviving suggests a sort of panic in not finishing the job. The type of panic one might feel if this were, say, their first rodeo. On top of that, who the Zodiac is remains a mystery that seems impossible to solve. And maybe that's because it's not the work of just one person. And getting back to Post, there were reports that he attacked one of his disciples with a hammer when he confronted his mentor about his resemblance to the Zodiac. This violent response to questioning would become a pattern. Anyone who probed too deeply into Post's past faced serious consequences. And Post had distinctive scars on his forehead that matched witnesses' descriptions of the Zodiac as well. And his military background explained the wing walker boot prints found at the Lake Berryessa crime scene. Even more intriguing, the case breakers claim that Post's full name has been uncovered from one of the Zodiac's unsolved ciphers. When Post died in 2018, he was living under a mental health conservatorship, supposedly suffering from dementia. But those who knew him best, including his former stepson, believe this was his final act of deception, a way to avoid questioning about his past. His remains were scattered in the Sierra Mountains, in the same wilderness where he trained his killing posse. While Kane stalked the streets and Post trained killers in the mountains, another suspect lived a seemingly quiet life operating movie projectors in San Francisco. Richard Marshall's connection to the Zodiac case is less about violent encounters and more about a web of eerie coincidences that perfectly align with the killer's patterns. Marshall lived in a basement apartment at 143 Scott Street in San Fran, just blocks away from where Paul Stine picked up his final fare. This location becomes particularly significant when you consider the Zodiac's November 9, 1969 letter, where he wrote about having a death machine in his basement. But it's not just where Marshall lived, it's when and where he moved that got him on the authorities' radar. He had a habit of appearing in key locations just as the Zodiac became active there. In 1966, he was in Riverside when Cherry Joe Bates was murdered. And then he moved to San Francisco, where his basement apartment was less than a mile from the Stine murder site. Later, he relocated to Front Street in San Rafael just before the Zodiac started sending letters, some with references to almost unknown occult films. Richard was obsessed with a 1908 silent film called The Red Phantom. Years later, in 1974, the Zodiac sent his Red Phantom letter, a reference so obscure that investigators had to dig to even figure out he was talking about a movie. Of all the suspected Zodiac communications, this one seemed oddly specific, mentioning a film that few people even knew existed. And Marshall also worked as a ham radio operator, giving him technical knowledge that aligned with the Zodiac's communications and codes. The killer's letters often showed someone with an understanding of both old films and communication systems, two areas where Marshall was an expert. And if that doesn't raise enough alarms, then how about this? On more than one occasion, Marshall was known to mention to his friends and acquaintances that he had found something much more exciting than sex. He never said what it was, but it's an odd comment that gets even weirder when connected to the Zodiac's letters, where he talks about hunting humans being more fun than killing wild game. When confronted with these connections in 1989, Marshall didn't deny them. Instead, he acknowledged the similarities, but claimed they were coincidental.
I hope the poor guy doesn't look like me, but the fact is that the characteristics you just mentioned fit me almost to a T. I really am startled at the mass and accuracy of the detail. And obviously, if they had been that forthcoming about that at the time, I would have understood why they were investigating me. My innocence notwithstanding, the details do fit.
Now, 2022 brought a seismic shift to Zodiac research when author Jarrett Kobik published How to Find Zodiac, pointing to a suspect hiding in plain sight for over 50 years. And Paul Doerr, a North Bay resident whose paper trail reads like a blueprint for becoming the Zodiac Killer. The evidence begins simply enough. Doerr maintained a post office box in Vallejo, ground zero for the first Zodiac murders. At 42 years old and 5'9" in 1969, he perfectly matched witness descriptions. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Doerr obsessively published fanzines and letters, and hidden in these writings lay shocking parallels to the Zodiac's communications. And 3 days after the killer sent his infamous "My Name Is" cipher, Doerr published his own cryptogram in his Tolkien fanzine, Habitalia. And Kobik goes into detail and argues the solution to Doerr's puzzle matches one of only 3 possible solutions to the Zodiac's unsolved message. Then there's the Lake Berryessa attack, where the killer appeared in that iconic executioner's hood. Well, Doerr, as it turns out, was deeply involved with the Society for Creative Anachronism, medieval cosplayers who specialized in period-accurate clothing and combat. A Renaissance fair even took place near the lake the day of the attack. Whoever the Zodiac really was, well, we know they were into cryptograms and had the ability to make their own costume, which, when you narrow it down, not a whole lot of people can hit on both these, but Doerr certainly did. Furthermore, an undated photograph shows Doerr wielding a knife matching witness descriptions from Berryessa. Then in his fanzine called Pioneer, Doerr detailed the exact formula to make an Anfo bomb that the Zodiac would later threaten to use. And this wasn't common knowledge before the Anarchist Cookbook's publication in 1971, so once again, a very specific detail between Doerr and the Zodiac. His reading preferences also tell their own dark connections. Among his book collection, The Strange Ways of Man, which describes headhunters killing victims to create slaves in the afterlife, mirroring the Zodiac's infamous claim about his mission being to collect slaves for the afterlife. Perhaps most interestingly, Doerr's own daughter read Kobik's book planning to sue. Instead, she found herself convinced, confirming her father's violent tendencies. We still have one more suspect to talk about, but it takes us way back just before the Zodiac terrorized Northern Cali. And back then, a young woman named Cherry Jo Bates was brutally murdered outside the Riverside City College library. The killer disabled her Volkswagen Beetle and waited in the dark until closing time and then attacked when she came out, stabbing and slashing her. The date was October 30th of 1966. Her body was discovered right there on the school's grounds the following morning. Among the library staff who were questioned, suspicions immediately fell on one man, Ross Sullivan. At first glance, Sullivan seemed an unlikely murderer. A library assistant with an extensive knowledge of codes and ciphers, he was known for writing cryptic poetry that left his co-workers a bit unsettled. Beneath his quiet demeanor lay a troubled mind. He suffered from bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, requiring multiple hospitalizations throughout his life. But it wasn't just Sullivan's odd behavior that caught everyone's attention. It was the fact that he disappeared. After Bates's murder, he was gone for several days without explanation. When he returned, the staff noticed some unsettling habits he'd picked up, like how after his shift, the way he stand by the library pit walls for hours, not moving, just watching students go by. In 1967, Sullivan moved up to Santa Cruz, right when the Zodiac's activities started shifting to Northern California. His background in codes and literature matched up perfectly with the killer's literary references and complex ciphers. The Zodiac's letters showed knowledge of the Mikado and medieval literature, both subjects Sullivan had studied deeply. But the official investigation paints a different picture, and police claim Sullivan had an alibi for the Bates murder, though the details on that are still pretty hazy. That famous sketch photo of the Zodiac, the one where he wears the glasses, above all other suspects, very much so, looks a whole lot like Sullivan as well. So there's that too. Now, each of these men had the means, motive, and opportunity. Each had strange connections to this case that can't be easily explained away. And each adds another layer to America's most enduring criminal mystery. And think about it. If the Zodiac really did kill more than 20 people, as many investigators believe, then looking at just Arthur Lee Allen means ignoring a huge part of the story. The true scope of the Zodiac's crimes might be far larger than we imagine, stretching from California to Nevada, and possibly even beyond that. When you step back and look at all these suspects together, you start to understand why the Zodiac case has never been solved. It's not just about finding the right suspect, it's about understanding how many different men could have been behind the mask. How many different paths could have led to those brutal murders and taunting letters. And maybe it was Arthur Lee Allen after all, but maybe it was Lawrence Kane, or Gary Post, or Paul Doerr, or maybe it was somebody else. Someone whose name, well, we don't even know. So that's it for this week's episode of Everytown. Hope you all enjoyed it. Check us out on Patreon for exclusive episodes each week and an entire library of 200 additional episodes. Remember to come back next week for another episode filled with scary, strange, and mysterious stories. Because you never know, maybe your town will be next.